As the final shots of World War II faded into the summer of 1945, Europe was left to face the monumental task of rebuilding a shattered continent. This rebuilding was not only a question of cities, factories, and infrastructure. It also encompassed the military installations and defenses that had once been vital to the continent's security. Among the most visible remnants of wartime preparation were the border fortifications that crisscrossed Europe. These concrete and steel barriers had been erected as the last line of defense, designed to withstand the onslaught of military aggressions that had come to define the war. But with the end of hostilities, the question arose: what should be done with these massive, expensive, and increasingly obsolete structures? These fortifications were not all the same, nor were they born from the same need. Some, like the Maginot Line in France, were conceived before the war as a strategic defense against a German invasion. Others were hastily constructed during the war itself as part of the Axis and Allied forces' efforts to defend occupied territories. These fortifications, often built from reinforced concrete, steel, and various other durable materials, dotted the borders of the major combatants. Many were equipped with heavy artillery, machine gun emplacements, and other defensive systems designed to repel enemy troops or armor. Some had underground bunkers, barracks, and stockpiles of ammunition. However, by the time the war ended, it had become clear that these fortifications were far less useful than originally envisioned. The technology of warfare had advanced far beyond the static defense lines that had once seemed so formidable. The mobility of tanks, aircraft, and, most importantly, the emerging threat of rockets and missiles had rendered these static defenses obsolete. No longer were massive fortifications a sufficient deterrent against the swiftly changing nature of warfare. As a result, these installations became, almost overnight, a burden, a remnant of the past that no longer served any immediate purpose in the post-war world. This shift was immediately felt in the military and economic pressures that followed the war. Nations that had been involved in the conflict were now contending with the aftermath of their wartime economies. The end of hostilities meant the cessation of defense spending on a scale that had not been seen since the outbreak of the war. As countries transitioned from wartime economies to peacetime recovery, the funds that had once been dedicated to maintaining and fortifying defenses were now needed elsewhere, on reconstruction, on social services, and on rebuilding economies shattered by years of conflict. In France, for example, the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the border with Germany, had once represented the pinnacle of defensive military strategy. The line extended nearly 450 kilometers, running from the Swiss border in the south to Luxembourg in the north, and included numerous fortresses, bunkers, and artillery positions. Constructed during the 1920s and 1930s, the Maginot Line was designed to provide France with a defensive advantage in case of a German attack. Yet, in 1940, the Germans bypassed the line entirely by invading through the lowlands of Belgium, rendering the fortifications almost useless. By 1945, with the defeat of Nazi Germany, the line had lost any remaining strategic importance. The French government, now faced with the task of reorienting the national economy, began the process of dismantling and decommissioning large portions of the Maginot Line. This was a costly endeavor as much of the structure was still in good condition, though increasingly outdated. The materials used in the construction, steel, concrete, and reinforced iron, were of high quality, but the expense of maintaining the line far outweighed its utility. Furthermore, the emphasis on modernizing the French military to reflect the new realities of warfare made the line an expensive anachronism. By 1946, much of the Maginot Line was abandoned, though some parts were preserved for their historical value or repurposed for civilian use. The cost of demolition and repurposing was significant. In some instances, entire sections of the line were simply left to decay. However, the fortifications themselves remained a stark reminder of the war and the military strategies that had once seemed invincible. This was a problem shared by other countries as well. In Germany, the situation was even more complex. The Nazi regime had constructed a vast network of fortifications throughout Europe, particularly in the areas that were most vulnerable to Allied attacks. The Siegfried Line, or Westwall for example, was a series of defensive structures that ran along the western borders of Germany, designed to hold off any advancing Allied forces. With the defeat of Nazi Germany, the West Wall was abandoned, and its military significance quickly diminished. However, the remnants of these fortifications still dotted the countryside, with no clear plan for their disposal or repurposing. For a country now divided into zones of occupation, the fortifications that had once been built to protect the Third Reich were now a symbol of its collapse. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was little coordination between the occupying powers regarding the fate of these military installations. The Americans, British, and Soviets each dealt with the remnants of the German fortifications in different ways. The Soviets, for instance, often used the remnants of fortifications for military purposes, while the Americans and British were more likely to simply dismantle them. But the scale of the task was overwhelming. Throughout Germany and Austria, old bunkers, artillery emplacements, and even entire military complexes were abandoned, left to decay or be scavenged for materials. Yet, there was no unified strategy for dealing with the enormous quantity of military hardware and infrastructure that had been constructed during the war. In many instances, these fortifications were simply left behind, considered too costly or impractical to demolish. Some were turned into tourist attractions, with certain sections preserved for their historical significance. Others were repurposed as storage facilities, industrial sites, or housing. The process of repurposing or abandoning these military installations was slow and haphazard, as nations focused their efforts on rebuilding their economies and societies. The fortifications became silent witnesses to the sudden and abrupt shift from war to peace. The economic pressures were not limited to the fortifications of Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union inherited an enormous legacy of military installations and defenses constructed during the war. The Soviets had built vast networks of bunkers, fortifications, and military bases across countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. However, with the cessation of active conflict, the Soviet Union also found itself struggling to maintain these installations. The cost of upkeep and the need for a more modern military strategy led to the gradual abandonment of many of these sites. In some cases, they were repurposed for industrial or agricultural use, but again, the emphasis was on economic and logistical priorities rather than military ones. As the 1940s drew to a close, it became clear that Europe was facing a new era, one in which the once dominant power of military fortifications would no longer hold sway. The pace of technological innovation, the rise of air power, and the strategic importance of nuclear weapons all played a role in diminishing the need for traditional border fortifications. The vast networks of concrete and steel that had once been designed to withstand armies were now regarded as outdated relics of a bygone era. They were no longer relevant to the new political and military landscape of post-war Europe. Yet, as the world entered the Cold War, the legacies of these fortifications would not be easily erased. The scars of war, both physical and psychological, would linger for years to come. And even as Europe chose peace, the old fortifications would remain standing, silent monuments to the conflict that had reshaped the continent. By the end of the 1940s, as Europe moved further away from the immediate destruction of World War II, the immense task of dismantling, repurposing, and sometimes preserving the vast network of fortifications scattered across the continent was slowly evolving into an afterthought. While Europe was focused on rebuilding its shattered economies and laying the foundations for peace, the once prized military defenses that had stood at the heart of wartime strategy were now increasingly seen as burdens, both financially and strategically. The monumental cost of maintaining or demolishing these structures grew as the years passed, and there was little consensus among European nations about what should be done with the remnants of these wartime fortifications. Some structures were gradually decommissioned, while others were simply left to rot in the open fields or overgrown forests, fading away with time. Yet, in some areas, the remnants of these military behemoths found new roles, forever reshaping the landscape and the way they were remembered. As the 1950s arrived, the geopolitical landscape in Europe had begun to shift dramatically. The advent of the Cold War created a new division across the continent, with Eastern and Western Europe split by the so-called Iron Curtain. The border fortifications that had once been designed to guard against military invasion were now caught in the ideological standoff between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. While the bulk of Germany was now divided into zones of occupation, with Western Germany under American, British, and French control, and Eastern Germany under Soviet influence, the very existence of these fortifications became an even more complex issue. In the West, former fortifications from the war were systematically abandoned or demolished. In France, much of the Maginot Line, though no longer seen as strategically useful, became the subject of public debate. Although sections of the line had been maintained or repurposed as tourist attractions, the economic costs of upkeep and the changing nature of military defense strategies led to further disbandment. The French government faced immense pressure to allocate resources to reconstruction efforts, roads, schools, hospitals, and homes for the millions of people displaced during the war. Maintaining static defenses against the Soviet threat, which had already begun to materialize in the 1950s, seemed increasingly irrelevant. The Maginot Line's lingering presence was thus an uncomfortable reminder of a past that no longer matched the future the country was heading into. While many of the fortifications were demolished, some portions of the Maginot Line found new uses. In the more remote sections, the deep underground bunkers and tunnels were repurposed as storage facilities. Others were converted into civilian shelters, a reminder of the precariousness of Europe's post-war security environment. In some instances, sections of the line became home to small communities of farmers or industrial workers who found use for the sturdy structures in their own trades. However, these conversions were often piecemeal and fragmented, driven more by necessity than by any coherent national strategy. Meanwhile, in Germany, the fate of the remaining fortifications was marked by both neglect and confusion. The Siegfried Line, which had once been the pride of Nazi Germany's defense strategy, was left to deteriorate in the wake of the war's end. The sheer scale of the West Wall, with its vast network of bunkers, machine gun posts, and anti-tank defenses, made it nearly impossible for the new German government to dismantle or repurpose in its entirety. Although much of the infrastructure was left behind by the retreating German military, much of it was either demolished or repurposed by the Allies in the immediate post-war years. In some cases, sections of the West Wall became sites for scrap metal harvesting, as the demand for raw materials was high in the war's aftermath. The Allies, particularly the Americans, viewed the fortifications as a potential resource and removed large sections of steel, iron, and concrete for use in other rebuilding projects. It was an ironic and somewhat sad end for the once proud fortifications that had been intended to hold back Allied forces but were now reduced to being a source of raw material for the post-war economy. Yet, even though the fortifications of Germany and France were being progressively dismantled, the legacy of these structures continued to loom large. Many of these fortifications became permanent features of the European landscape, acting as visible scars from the war that could not be erased so easily. Entire families lived and worked in old bunkers that had once been filled with soldiers and military equipment. Former fortifications were used as warehouses or storage depots, while others stood abandoned and neglected, slowly being swallowed up by the encroaching vegetation. However, it was in the Eastern Bloc, under Soviet control, that the remnants of World War II fortifications took on a new, more complex significance. The Soviet Union, faced with a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape, was keenly aware of the need to maintain its own military presence across Eastern Europe. The enormous network of bunkers, fortifications, and military bases built by Nazi Germany in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were repurposed not for peace, but for the ongoing military struggle between East and West. These sites became key strategic assets for the Soviets in the early years of the Cold War. In Poland, for example, some of the fortifications left behind by the Germans were revived and incorporated into the Soviet defense network. These sites, while no longer part of the Nazi war effort, were transformed into military outposts for the Red Army. The Soviet military often refurbished the bunkers, reinforcing them and modernizing the facilities with the most advanced equipment available at the time. In a sense, the old German fortifications found new life within the broader ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. In other cases, These fortifications remained as reminders of the Nazi occupation and Soviet control. Many of the old bunkers in Eastern Europe were not repurposed but were left abandoned, deteriorating as the years went on. With the Cold War in full swing, the Soviet leadership in Moscow largely neglected these relics of the past in favor of newer, more efficient military installations. The Soviet Union's focus shifted towards developing missile defense systems, air defense networks, and nuclear deterrence, leaving many of these old fortifications as forgotten relics. Despite their reduced importance as active military assets, the legacy of these fortifications endured in other ways. In many parts of Europe, these structures became part of the collective memory of the war. Their very existence was a reminder of the suffering and devastation that had once consumed the continent. Local populations in the areas where these fortifications had been built found themselves living in their shadows, sometimes reimagining the spaces in ways that were entirely divorced from their original military function. The fortifications that had been built to hold back armies were now serving as a stark reminder of a Europe forever changed by the war. They stood as silent monuments, a testament to the scale of conflict that had once engulfed the continent. And though many of them were abandoned or repurposed, they were far from irrelevant. These remnants of the past became the subject of increasing interest in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, as historians, preservationists, and enthusiasts began to recognize the historical significance of these structures. Today, the remnants of Europe's border fortifications exist in a variety of forms. Some have been preserved as museums or historical sites, offering a glimpse into the strategic thinking of wartime leaders. Others have been forgotten, left to slowly deteriorate in remote forests or rural fields, their historical importance fading with time. Yet the question remains, what should have been done with these massive, outdated remnants of a war that had ended decades ago? As the years passed, the fate of Europe's fortifications became symbolic of the broader struggle to come to terms with the past and adapt to the future.